There are more goats alive on Earth right now than there are people in North and South America combined. Roughly 1.1 billion of them, spread across nearly every country with dry land and a hillside. And yet, almost none of them live anywhere close to a factory. Unlike cattle, unlike chickens, the goat has spent most of human history resisting the assembly line. Too small a yield per animal, too easily stressed by crowding, too prone to disease the moment you pack thousands of them together. For most of the world, a goat still means a handful of animals tied to a stake behind someone's house. But in a handful of places, a cooperative dairy in New Zealand, a river valley in northern China, a cheese factory in rural France, that resistance has started to break down. Machines now milk over 1,000 goats an hour without a single human hand touching an udder. This is the story of how that happened, and why, for the other 99% of the world's goats, it still hasn't. Start with the number itself, because it's bigger than almost anyone assumes going in. There are approximately 1.1 billion goats on Earth. Asia holds the majority of them, nearly 58% of the global herd, with Africa close behind at almost 36%. Most of that concentrated in sub-Saharan Africa. India alone is home to roughly 150 million goats, more than any other single country, and more than 3 times the entire goat population of the United States and Europe combined. Those goats aren't idle. In 2023, the world produced just over 20.5 million tons of goat milk, up from 6.5 million tons in 1970, which means global goat milk output has more than tripled in about 50 years. Asia alone accounts for roughly 12 million tons of that total. India, again, sits at the top of the list, producing more than 6 million tons of goat milk a year on its own, more than Sudan and Pakistan, the next 2 largest producers, combined. Meat tells a similar story, with different leaders. In 2024, China produced 2.5 million tons of goat meat, more than any other country on Earth, worth an estimated $21.8 billion. India followed at 1.5 million tons, worth $8.5 billion, and Pakistan came in third at 539,000 tons. Together, those 3 countries account for 61% of all the goat meat produced worldwide. Analysts project the global goat meat market will keep growing, reaching an estimated 8.6 million tons and $63.7 billion in annual value by 2035. Here's the part that makes this story different from almost every other how millions of animals become a product story on this channel. For cattle, and especially for chickens, the industrial system is the default. Most of the world's beef, milk, and poultry already move through some version of a mechanized supply chain. Goats are the exception. The overwhelming majority of the world's 1.1 billion goats are still raised the way they've been raised for thousands of years, in small herds of a handful to a few dozen animals, tied, penned, or walked out to graze by a single family, with no automation anywhere in the process. Industrial-scale, fully mechanized goat operations exist, and they're growing fast in a few very specific places, but they remain the minority. Almost everywhere on Earth, a goat is still, functionally, a small farmer's animal. That gap, between a genuinely enormous global herd and a genuinely tiny industrial footprint, is the whole reason this story is worth telling. Something has kept goats out of the factory for longer than almost any other major livestock species, and in a few specific places, something finally changed. The obstacle isn't stubbornness or tradition alone. It's biology, and it's math. A single dairy cow can produce well over 25 liters of milk a day under modern management. A dairy goat, even a good one, produces a fraction of that, commonly somewhere around 3 to 4 liters a day. To match the output of one industrial cattle operation, a goat dairy needs vastly more animals, which means vastly more individual udders to find, clean, attach equipment to, and release, twice a day, every day, for the life of the herd. That labor problem alone kept goat dairies small for most of the 20th century. Milking machines built for cows don't fit goats. The equipment, the stall height, the timing, all of it was designed around a different animal. For decades, scaling up a goat dairy meant scaling up the number of human hands doing the milking, by hand or with adapted, awkward equipment, one goat at a time. There was no way to multiply the labor without multiplying the workers. Disease made the problem worse the moment anyone tried to compress large numbers of goats into a smaller footprint. Two conditions in particular have shaped how the industry thinks about density. Caprine arthritis encephalitis, a viral disease that causes chronic, incurable joint, neurological, lung, and udder damage after a long, silent incubation period. And caseous lymphadenitis, a bacterial infection that produces abscesses and spreads more easily wherever animals are crowded close together. Published veterinary research comparing intensive and semi-intensive dairy goat farms found the difference isn't theoretical. In one study, over 12% of intensive farms had at least one goat showing visible abscesses from caseous lymphadenitis, compared with none of the semi-intensive farms studied. Pack goats together at industrial density without managing for it, and you don't just get more milk. You get more disease, faster. So for most of the world, the math never worked in favor of scaling up. Low yield per animal, a milking bottleneck that couldn't be automated with cattle equipment, and a real, documented health cost to crowding. 3 separate walls stacked on top of each other. Cattle and chicken farming broke through equivalent barriers decades ago. Goat farming, for the most part, didn't. Wherever the wall did eventually come down, it came down for a very specific reason. The breakthrough wasn't a new breed of goat or a new drug. It was a machine that finally fit the animal it was built for. The rotary milking parlor, adapted specifically for goats instead of cattle. The mechanics are almost hypnotic to watch. A circular platform rotates continuously, slowly, carrying dozens of individual stalls, bales, around in a loop. As each goat steps onto the platform, she's guided into her own bale and automatically headlocked into position. A measured portion of feed drops in front of her the moment she's secured, keeping her calm and occupied. A robotic carriage built into the platform positions the milking cups directly beneath her teats and attaches them automatically. No human reaching under the animal by hand. By the time the platform has carried her almost the full way around, roughly 360 degrees, the milking is finished. The system detects when milk flow stops, automatically removes the cups, and sprays the udder with disinfectant before she steps off. The next goat has already been loading into the vacated bale behind her. The numbers this unlocks are the real story. A rotary system built specifically for goats, the kind of machine now running in commercial dairies, lets a single human operator milk up to 1,300 goats in an hour. Compare that to hand milking, where a skilled worker might manage a few dozen animals in the same span, and the entire labor bottleneck wall that had kept goat dairies small for a century simply stops applying. A herd that would have required dozens of milkers working in shifts can now run through a fraction of that staff, milked twice a day, every day, with far more consistency than any number of human hands could provide. It didn't happen everywhere at once, and it still hasn't. The rotary goat parlor is expensive to install and only makes economic sense at a herd size most of the world's goat keepers will never reach. But in the handful of places where herd sizes did grow large enough to justify the investment, the machine did exactly what it promised. It turned a labor-limited animal into one that could, for the first time, actually scale. None of this happened without real, documented costs, and none of them have been fully resolved. The disease math from the wall didn't disappear just because the milking got automated. It got layered underneath the new efficiency. Caprine arthritis encephalitis and caseous lymphadenitis remain the two conditions that serious dairy goat operations specifically screen and accredit their herds against, precisely because packing more animals into a smaller footprint, even with better equipment, still raises transmission risk if it isn't actively managed. Veterinary researchers have built dedicated on-farm welfare assessment protocols specifically for intensive dairy goat housing, a tool that simply didn't need to exist when every herd was small. The existence of the protocol is itself evidence of the problem. Welfare in a crowded, mechanized barn takes deliberate, ongoing work to protect. It isn't automatic just because the milking is. There's a second, quieter tension underneath the disease question. Most of the animals producing this growing volume of industrial milk and meat are still, globally, a tiny fraction of the world's goats. The 1,300 goats an hour rotary parlor is real. So is the fact that it exists in maybe a few dozen operations worldwide, while thousands of villages across India, across the Sahel, across Central Asia, still milk their handful of goats exactly the way their grandparents did. Scaling up hasn't replaced the traditional system. It's grown up alongside it, in a small number of specific places, without touching the vast majority of the world's herd at all. None of that makes the automated systems illegitimate, or the traditional ones obsolete. It just means the industry that actually shows up in a highlight reel. Robotic milking carousels, spray drying towers, vertically integrated supply chains, is a genuine minority position inside a much larger, much less visible, global goat economy that hasn't changed nearly as much. Follow one animal through the modern system, and the scale becomes concrete. It starts before birth. On the larger operations, breeding is increasingly selective. Animals chosen specifically for higher milk yield or better meat conformation. A deliberate departure from the largely unmanaged breeding that still defines most pastoral herds worldwide. Feed is calculated and measured rather than simply grazed. One of the largest operations in China's Shaanxi province, a fully vertically integrated goat dairy enterprise called Shaoyang Miaoqi, runs its own forage cultivation alongside the herd itself, controlling the entire chain from the grass the animals eat through to the finished product on a shelf. Milking happens on the rotary system described earlier. Measured feed, automatic headlock, robotic teat cup attachment, up to 1,300 goats an hour through a single unit. The raw milk doesn't stay on the farm. It's chilled immediately and moved to centralized processing, often at a scale that dwarfs any individual farm's output. Across Shaanxi province as a whole, goat milk yield runs around 600 tons a day, and at least 8 separate enterprises in the region each process more than 300 tons of goat milk daily on their own. From there, the milk becomes one of two things, depending on where in the world it's headed. Spray-dried into powder, it becomes infant formula or nutritional milk powder, the specialty New Zealand's dairy goat Co-operative built its entire business on. Founded in 1984, it developed the world's first commercialized infant formula made from goat milk, and its Hamilton plant now produces 2.3 tons of finished infant formula and 2.7 tons of base milk powder every single hour it runs. In China, that same category, goat milk infant formula, has become one of the fastest-growing segments in the country's dairy industry. 16 of Shaanxi's 19 infant formula manufacturers now make a goat milk version specifically, producing more than 30,000 tons a year between them, a category that's been growing at over 30% annually. Or the milk becomes cheese. France remains the world's leading producer of pure goat cheese, built on an unusual structure. More than 3,000 small individual producers feed their milk into around 60 larger dairies, together producing over 265 million pounds of goat cheese a year. One of those larger dairies, Chavroux, opened in 1985 and now employs roughly 200 people running what looks, from the inside, exactly like any other modern food factory, despite the artisanal reputation goat cheese still carries in most people's minds. France doesn't even produce enough goat milk domestically to keep facilities like that running at full capacity. The country imports close to 99 million liters of goat milk a year, much of it from Spain and the Netherlands, specifically to feed its own cheese industry. The meat side of the industry runs mostly as a separate infrastructure, concentrated overwhelmingly in China, India, and Pakistan, the same 3 countries responsible for 61% of the world's goat meat production. It hasn't mechanized to nearly the same degree as the dairy side. There's no equivalent here of the 1,300 goats an hour rotary parlor. Goat meat processing, even at large scale, remains closer to traditional slaughter and butchery methods than the highly automated lines built for cattle or poultry. The demand is enormous and growing, but so far, nobody has built the goat meat equivalent of the machine that transformed the dairy side. Put the numbers from both sides of the industry next to each other, and the shape of it becomes clear. On the dairy side, 20.5 million tons of goat milk produced globally in 2023, more than triple the 1970 figure. A New Zealand cooperative moving 5 tons of finished and base powder product through a single facility every hour. A Chinese province processing 600 tons of raw goat milk a day, with individual enterprises inside it each handling more than half that on their own. A French cheese industry built on 3,000 small suppliers feeding 60 industrial-scale dairies, one of which alone employs 200 people to keep up with 265 million pounds of annual cheese production. A factory number hiding behind an artisanal reputation. On the meat side, 8.6 million tons of goat meat projected globally by 2035, a market expected to be worth nearly $64 billion, growing on the strength of demand in China, India, and Pakistan specifically, 3 countries that already account for well over half the world's current production, without anything resembling the automated systems reshaping the dairy side. And underneath both of those numbers, the harder fact: 1.1 billion goats worldwide, and only a small, specific fraction of them touched by any of this. The rotary parlors, the spray drying towers, the vertically integrated Chinese operations, the French industrial cheese dairies, all of it real, all of it growing, and all of it still a minority position inside a global goat economy where most animals never see a machine. Every other major livestock species on this channel has a version of this story that ends differently. Cattle went industrial generations ago. Chickens went industrial so completely that a traditional chicken farm is now the unusual case, not the default. Goats never finished that transition, and the evidence increasingly suggests they might not in the way cattle and poultry did. The biology doesn't allow the same shortcuts. Lower yield per animal, a disease profile that punishes density harder, a milking problem that took until genuinely modern robotics to solve it all. Where the industrial system has taken hold, it required a machine precise enough to handle 1,300 individual udders an hour without a single human touch. And even then, it only made economic sense at a scale most of the world's goat keepers will never reach. So the goat industry that exists today isn't one story. It's 2, running side by side without much overlap. A small, fast-growing, increasingly automated system feeding infant formula and packaged cheese into global supply chains from a handful of facilities in New Zealand, China, and France. And a vastly larger, unchanged system of small herds and family-run flocks that still produces most of the world's goat milk and meat exactly the way it always has. One animal, one household at a time. Both of those are true about the same 1.1 billion animals at the exact same moment. If stories like this, where the modern, mechanized version of something turns out to be the exception, not the rule, are what you're here for, subscribe, because the next one goes looking for the same gap somewhere else.